Hey everybody, welcome back to James Draws Everything. Today continuing our series with drawing every country's flag. And today I did a lot of homework for this one because I really like talking about this country. We're going to be going back into the Iberian Peninsula in Europe, and we already did Spain, so you know what that means. We're going to be doing Portugal. And it's Portugal kind of has a lot of the same history as Spain, kind of leading into modernity, right? Just kind of being there on that Iberian Peninsula, racially the same people. You know, also kind of went through that that Reconquista period, reclaiming the land from the Muslims that took over that part of the world. Kind of post Middle Ages. And then Portugal kind of evolved from the Kingdom of Leon to do, so like even before, so I'm just kind of making sure I got this straight here. So even before like the Reconquista period, there's already sort of a Portuguese identity, right? Because they do speak their own language. Portuguese is different than Spanish. Okay, so that identity is already kind of forged prior to that. And then, Spain does kind of have like a lot of regions, like autonomous regions, well, regions that want to be autonomous, that are kind of separate from Spain, like, for a while, like Aragon. So Portugal never really becomes part of Spain, right? I believe there's a treaty that establishes a Portuguese kingdom separate from Spain, and because of that treaty, Portugal actually, its borders have almost been unchanged for hundreds of years, so it can lay claim to being basically one of the oldest states in the world. So that's kind of cool. And why am I so interested in Portugal? Well, of course, 20th century Portugal has one of what I believe is one of the great men in history, just like a Franco in Salazar. And Portugal and Spain have extremely similar histories, but there's actually quite a few points where they diverge, right? So Portugal never really has the violent civil war that Spain has, but they do run into some issues. And Portugal and Spain, right? So they're both kind of neutral. Not Portugal, not as much during World War One, but 1 and 2, Portugal is neutral during that, and I think they have they probably played neutrality better than Spain did in some ways, but we'll get to that. Early Portugal, right? They become a maritime power in the 15th century. So this is another reason why this country interests me so much. It's because it is very small, and you don't really think of Portugal as being a world power. But then when you kind of check your boxes off, right, and you look at Portuguese history, you're like, wait a minute, this place, they had an empire stretching all the way from South America through Africa into India, into the Philippines. So like, why don't we talk about them like in the same way that we do, say, like the British Empire or the Belgians or the French? And that's a good question because, Portugal maybe doesn't have as much going on with like domestic policies, like as far as like some of those other states, but they're kind of a country that, kind of punches above its weight, right? So there's a lot of stuff going on there that should be worth talking about when you're talking about great powers, and I do think Portugal deserves to be classified as a great power. Okay, so Portugal gave the world some of its great explorers as well during the Age of Exploration. Something happens in 1755. An earthquake rocks Portugal, or it actually rocks Lisbon, right, the capital of Portugal. And this is kind of one of those events, like to call it like a national scarring event, right? So if you want to think of the United States, think of the war between the states, or for modern times, think about something like September 11th, right? So where not only is it just a catastrophe, but this is something that is so catastrophic that it actually changes the entire attitude of the country, right? So there's about, I think like 50,000 people die in this earthquake, right? So, a lot of other countries, they had issues too with, natural disasters or acts of God that happen, and they have to be dealt with. But, this really, really changed Portugal. So Portugal, it kind of becomes, I want to say, like claustrophobic during this time period, right after the earthquake. So you have a king, right, that basically can't settle down, right? He's kind of moving from place to place. And this is where you really start to see Portugal develop its imperial identity, right? So Portugal is in Brazil kind of around this time period. And, the king, again, he's kind of paranoid. A lot of the royal families are, not just one king. And Portugal kind of, again, it develops this bizarre sort of claustrophobia to where they're more focused on external matters than internal, right? Because, 50,000 people dead in an earthquake, right? It's going to leave some ghosts, literal and figurative. Yeah, so Portugal actually, when Portugal starts exploring, the New World, you think of Brazil as like a colony, but I actually think that's, in some ways it kind of is, but it's kind of an incorrect way of looking at things because Brazil is obviously, going to be extremely prosperous for the Portuguese, right? It is a very prosperous colony for them, but it's actually more of like part of Portugal, right? So even during that time, Portugal forms basically a united kingdom with Brazil, the kingdom of Brazil and Portugal, right? It's not just a colony or like a vassal state; it's part of Brazil, and even the royal family starts traveling there and living there, which kind of leaves Portugal weak domestically, right? So they're focusing all of their efforts on this new empire. And then again, they also, expand into India. Portugal is expanding into Africa, and we don't really think of Portugal as being like one of the main African powers, but they really are. They're one of the powers, right? So Portugal always kind of, they arrive in like the Canary Island, the Azores. These are important places for shipping and setting up like naval bases, right? Kind of leaving the eastern hemisphere into the west. And we'll get to Africa in a little bit because Africa is kind of a completely different story. But yeah, and then they have a base. They have their own Hong Kong, right? The Portuguese have Macau in China. And interestingly enough, there, you kind of get the same song where the last note sung by the British Empire is when they basically, in a deal that really didn't work for the British and kind of, that's a whole nother story. We'll get to that some other time. But they give Hong Kong to the Chinese right around the same time that Portugal gives up Macau back to the Chinese. So they had a very big empire. And Portugal also, it's not really, how do I say this? It's not a very strong like martial class of people. I'm not saying like they're cowards or anything. It's just not really kind of baked into their culture as much. They do kind of become, through a series of treaties, they become almost overly reliant on Britain, right, as their own country kind of starts losing prestige. Mainly here, you have a very weak series of leaders where they just can't really get anything going, kind of leading into the 18th and 19th century. Portugal does become weak domestically, and there's really, wish there was more I could say about domestic affairs during this period, but really Portugal is focusing, the monarchy is focusing so much on outside stuff that Portugal itself kind of gets ignored during this period. So Britain, they actually start kind of delegitimizing a lot of the church functions in the state, domestically in Portugal. So Britain gets rid of the inquisitionary tactics used in Portuguese jurisprudence, right? So the British system is common law, right? Stare decisis, and then the Portuguese, along with a lot of other Catholic nations, they go by a civil code. And James, what is the difference between common law and civil code? All right, so common law is actually based on precedent, aka stare decisis. So the judge is actually the referee during the proceeding, where each party has their own lawyer, and they bring the facts of the case, and it's up to the judge, again, as the referee, to base his decision based on prior cases. Whereas in civil law, the judge is more like an inquisitor, right? And this dates back to the Catholic Inquisition, Christian inquisitionary times. So it's up to the judge to direct the case and ask questions of each party, and then base his decision on the written civil code of the country. Okay. Remember, everybody, James Draws Everything is a humble content creator, artist, and YouTuber. I do not give legal advice. Thank you. Where was I? So, so Britain really kind of starts bossing Portugal around a little bit. Not really adversarially, but again, it's just kind of a long period of delegitimization for the Portuguese people here. So, leading into the 20th century, Portugal at home is kind of a mess. The Third French Republic is actually kind of in effect leading up to this too, and Portugal did kind of get involved in the Napoleonic Wars a bit, but the Third French Republic starts taking a new revisionist form of history of the French Revolution, right? And in my opinion, not a good one. They start looking at Jacobinism more positively in retrospect. So there's more delegitimization of the church. Okay, so Portugal, there's a lot of New Republic leftist types that start seizing the assets of the church, right, and basically eliminating all of the Catholic elements, removing people from power that are Catholic, and moving more towards that French sort of a secular state. And so basically they start eliminating a lot of traditionalists, monarchists, anything basically linked to the old historical Portugal. And they actually do form a republic a lot like the French do. So you have the first Portuguese republic in 1910, right? So it's kind of a lot like the French Revolutionary stuff, influenced by the same policies, science, reason-based, anti-clerical, very anti-religion, anti-tradition. And basically once the right in Portugal is almost completely removed from power, the left in the Republic, and this is a similar song and dance, they start eating their own, right? Once the left gets its way, their entire ideology is not based on building, right? It's based on destroying things, right? Finding a purpose, like finding a dragon to slay. once they slayed their dragon, they start kind of eating their own, right? So you start racking up massive debts, and to fund the government. There's all these left-wing like parties basically just start eating their own, and the state basically collapses. The First Republic is not very long-lasted. And then something interesting happens, kind of like the Spanish Civil War and the crisis in Spain of the 30s, but taking place a little bit before that time. In 1933, you have the Portuguese Estado Novo. So that brings Portugal into modernity under a quote-unquote dictator, according to the international community, and that would be Antonio Salazar. All right, and we will be talking about Salazar because here at James Draws Everything, we believe in honoring great men. So even though this has a pretty intricate flag design here, you're still going to get some bonus content. All right, so there's just a couple little things I want to do to this Portuguese flag before we move on. So give me just a second here. They do have a pretty intricate little coat of arms. It's got like these little bands kind of around this wheel looking thing. So what does that flag of Portugal mean, James? So you got two bands of green and red. The national coat of arms is our armillary sphere and the Portuguese shield on the dividing line. The colors don't really have any meaning, at least officially. Just meant to some kind of popular versions of this say that the green symbolizes hope, and the red of, what do you think? The red, of course, the blood of the nation. So that's the Portuguese flag. And now we're gonna move on here. We're gonna talk a little bit more about Portuguese history because I think Portugal, just like Spain in the 20th century, deserves to be talked about a little bit more because those two countries, I think, avoided a lot of the excesses of the 20th century much, much better than their other kind of European counterparts. And kind of like the last gasp of like a dying Europe, right? So the Estado Novo means new state. So it's not I almost want to call it like looking back, right? I say like Portugal was a survivor, but it was a republic, right? It was not like a return to monarchy under Salazar. But so that lasts from 1933 to 1974. Salazar passes away a little bit before that. You have a Carnation revolution in 1974, which basically causes Portugal to give up all of its empire and then also form a much more liberal republic. Okay, so let's talk about this guy, though, before we get to that. So Antonio Salazar, one of the few great leaders of the 20th century. He was actually called by Dean Acheson. Remember President Harry Truman, his Secretary of State, said that Salazar was one of the only great philosopher kings of the 20th century, as far as like the philosopher king that Plato wrote about, in antiquity. So Salazar grew up fairly humble beginnings. He did go to the seminary, and he actually received his orders from the priesthood. Decided against joining the priesthood, though, and he actually becomes a political economy professor. Back when that actually meant something. Okay, so you hear professor, and it's like, okay, like nowadays, but yeah, this was back before the any degree is a good degree, like nonsense. And anyways, yeah, so he was an economics professor, political economy, and he was the prime minister in the fall of the first Portuguese Republic. He was the prime minister after that. So he was prime minister from 1932 to 1968. And you can already hear 32 to 68. Like, oh my God, that's a long time. He must be a dictator, right? Well, I guess if you want to call him that based on like a Western sort of like liberal interpretation. But I think there's a lot more to it here than that with this guy. So we'll get into that. Just kind of make sure I got his hairline right here. And we're going to do a nice black and white drawing of Mr. Salazar. Okay. Every time you see this guy too, he looks dapper as hell, right? He's got those Caudillo vibes, you know, a lot like Franco or even modern Bukele. When he dresses like that, he knows what he's doing. I should start a cologne or something, right? Called Caudillo vibes. So, hold on one second here. So as I'm drawing Salazar here, I want to tie this into Africa a little bit because I know we kind of alluded to it in Portuguese history, but I think there's a little bit more to talk about there. So, as far as Africa, hey, actually, let me bring out my handy map again, my little visual aid here. So Portugal had Mozambique, and then they also had Angola. Now there is a problem because the British are right there in the middle, right? The British have Rhodesia, and the Portuguese, it was always their idea to kind of have like a connector, like a connection going. I can't remember. I know that like what's his name? Cecil Rhodes wanted to build like the transcontinental railway. Can't remember if Portugal wanted a railway or not, but they did want to connect those two powers, right? So they wanted to connect the east and the west coast of Africa, and Britain kind of moved against that in a lot of ways, and it was kind of seen as a betrayal because Britain was always they're always very friendly towards the Portuguese due to the kind of alliance that they had. So that starts delegitimizing Portuguese Africa. In the 20th century, right, when Salazar is the prime minister, he puts up a fight, right? He is not giving up Mozambique to communists. Salazar was an ardent anti-communist. So that did not, of course, sit well with all the communist, quote-unquote, civil rights stuff that was going on in Africa. Again, all of it pretty much communist. So he loses his colonies, right? He loses Mozambique, loses Angola. It keeps his influence a little bit longer in like Cabo Verde and what was the other one? Like the Canary Islands, right? So those still have a lot of Portuguese influence to this day. But as far as like mainland Africa, they're kind of driven out, but not without a fight. Right? And again, with African decolonization, some fared a little bit better off than others, and the Portuguese, you got to give them credit, they did not give that up easily. Now, part of the Estado Novo, right, part of the new state, was that kind of like what they did with Brazil, these were not considered colonies, right? So Mozambique, Angola, they were supposed to be part of Portugal proper, right? Now, the Africans could not vote, right, in like Portuguese politics or anything like that. But that's a little bit different of a song and dance as well, because this guy banned politics, right? So the Estado Novo was going to be a non-political state. And remember, this guy was very smart man, professor of political economy. So he saw what happened with, the destruction of the monarchy and the failure, the outright failure of the first Portuguese Republic, right? Just basically going belly up immediately and running up these massive debts and whatnot. Salazar balanced the budget in a single year, right? Just started cutting out all the waste. He did not go back to like a Catholic state, right? He did still believe in separating the church and the state somewhat, but he also was not a leftist, so he did not take a nihilistic attitude towards the church and thought it should be destroyed and all of that, and have their property repossessed and nationalized. So he does He does restore some legitimacy to the Catholic Church, but does keep it separate as well. And yeah, no politics, so political parties are outlawed. And this is kind of one of those important like philosophy questions, right? Like in the West, we're so used to just thinking, universal suffrage and everyone gets a vote is somehow, like a universal good without question. It doesn't matter, hey, if you vote in policies that destroy your country, well, you asked for it, and at least you tried, right? He took a very different attitude to that. And let's see here, let me just figure something out. Okay, there we go. Where was I? Sorry, a little bit of a brain fart here. So we don't even really completely hold up to that, right? Like in the West, right? So you cannot vote if you're under a certain age, right? You cannot vote if you're incarcerated in most cases. So we do put limits on it, and his basically like his philosophy was that you need to have competent people running your government. So as long as the government is run competently, then why does stuff like voting matter? Like, why would you throw that away? Because the people that are living there, they don't always, one of those those classic like dictator know what's best for you sort of ideologies, I guess. But that actually is true in a lot of cases, though, because Portugal became a functioning country again overnight after what happened with the First Republic, right? They become economically sound. Their foreign possessions, they don't become money pits, kind of like what happens a lot of the times during colonization, right? Countries don't always get rich off of that. A lot of times colonization, depending on how it's administrated, can be a bit of a drain on your administrative resources. So yeah, that's why Salazar is interesting, because again, he wasn't really like super ideological about politics or anything. This was the no politics leader, and just because he was not a politician doesn't mean he wasn't like a statesman. He was a statesman, right? He had to navigate Portugal through World War II. Right, and while he did support Franco's Spain during the Spanish Civil War, right, because he saw communism encroachment into Europe as a absolute disaster if that happened, he played the neutrality card much better than Spain did. Right, Portugal still playing off some of its friendly relations with the British there. They kind of used that leverage and a little bit of leverage with Spain too to stay out of the war. So. He does die again in, I believe, 1974. He's out of power a little bit before that. And he's basically kind of like a corpse, like at this point. Like, he is very old. And I think during the latter few years, he's not really in control of his facilities that well, but he's still kind of paraded around as the leader of the country. And yeah, once the Carnation Revolution happens in the 70s, Portugal, just like Spain, becomes just another European country. So unfortunately, that is the legacy of Portugal. But I do think, Portugal never became communist, was not destroyed by the world wars. So was not destroyed by some of the ideologies of the 20th century either. So I think he deserves a lot of credit for that, and for making things work in Portugal again, right? Was not a monarchist, did not believe in restoring a monarchy, believed in creating a non-politic state that is run efficiently. So that's our man Salazar, the great philosopher king of Portugal, and that's the Portuguese flag. So I'm going to take off with that, and let me know what you think. Like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next video.